Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty heavy. It's the 2003 murder of this French actress, Marie Trintignant. And her boyfriend, the one who was convicted, was Bertrand Cantat. He was like a huge rock star in France.
Yeah.
And this whole thing, this case, it didn't just make headlines. It seriously divided public opinion over there. And it ended up sparking a big discussion, a real debate about domestic violence and how we think about it.
Totally. It was this tragic situation. And it happened while Marie was actually filming in Lithuania, which adds another layer to it all.
Right.
And then the legal stuff that followed, the trials and all that, it wasn't just about a celebrity scandal, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It really kind of exposed some of those attitudes in France.
Deeply ingrained, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so today, we want to kind of unpack what went down, but I think even more important is to try and figure out why this case in particular caused such a massive, just a firestorm of controversy.
So, to be clear, we're talking about a well-known actress who was killed by her partner, a super famous musician, while she was away for work.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, Cantat was convicted, right, but he only served a pretty short prison sentence considering the circumstances. And then to make things even more complex, he eventually went back to making music.
Yeah, and to really get into the nitty-gritty of how people responded to all of this, we're going to be looking at this really interesting piece from the BBC World Service. It's from their show called Witness History.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
And we're going to be mostly focused on a journalist. Her name is Michelle Fiennes. She was talking to Vicky Farncombe for this segment, and she had some really sharp observations about the case.
It's great for understanding how everything was seen at the time, you know, and also the long-term impact.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit and lay out the basics. In 2003, Marie Trintignant, she died as a result of violence inflicted by Bertrand Cantat. This happened in Lithuania. But it's super important to remember these weren't just random people.
Right. Cantat was, like I said, a major rock star, hugely popular in France.
Yeah.
And Marie Trintignant was this acclaimed actress, came from a whole dynasty of actors, very famous family. So their relationship was already kind of public. And then this tragedy happened, So it was instantly under this massive microscope.
Absolutely. And that celebrity factor, it amplified everything.
For sure.
It wasn't just a personal tragedy, which it was,
yeah,
but it instantly became this national conversation, this national thing. So after Marie's death, Cantat was eventually sentenced to 8 years in prison.
Right.
Now, just on the surface, that sounds like, okay, there's some sort of resolution.
Yeah.
But that's really where things get, complicated. This is where the controversy really started bubbling up.
Because he ended up getting released after just 4 years, right?
Yeah.
That seems to have been a major sticking point for people.
Oh, totally. For a large part of the public, the fact that he got out early felt deeply unfair. Mm-hmm. It felt like the punishment didn't match the seriousness of the violence that led to Marie's death.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this strong feeling that a life had been taken and the consequences just didn't, line up with that.
Yeah.
And then on top of all that, to add another layer to this already emotionally charged situation, Cantat decided he was going to go back to making music. And you can imagine that reignited a lot of the anger and frustration people felt from the beginning.
For sure.
And this is really where the witness history piece with Michelle Fiennes comes in. It really shines a light on how divided French society was on this. So on one side, and Fiennes talks about this, there were people who were just adamant that Cantat had committed a brutal murder. That this was an act of extreme violence against a woman.
Right.
And that him going back to public life, especially as a musician, someone who celebrated, was just not okay.
It's interesting, though, because at the same time, the BBC source also talks about this narrative of it being a, quote, crime of passion.
Yeah.
Which, honestly, it's kind of jarring to hear that term applied to something so violent. What does that framing even mean?
It's a really, really important question. When Fiennes talks about the crime of passion angle, it points to this way of looking at the violence. Like it was this spontaneous outburst, this tragic outburst of intense emotion, but not planned.
Oh, okay.
Instead of seeing it as this deliberate act of aggression, of control.
Yeah.
And the source suggests that this interpretation, even if unintentionally, kind of minimized how serious the violence actually was.
Yeah.
And it kind of glossed over the whole context of potential domestic abuse.
So this difference in how people saw the crime, like whether it was a brutal murder or a crime of passion, it kind of like revealed something deeper about French society back then.
Exactly. The BBC source makes the argument that this case brought to light what they called outdated attitudes to domestic violence.
Right.
And it really pinpoints this tendency, which might have been, more common back then, to not fully recognize domestic violence for what it is.
Right.
And to not treat it as seriously as it should be.
As a crime.
As a crime. Yeah, exactly. And there might have been this tendency to see incidents like this as like private matters,
Yeah.
Or just the result of, it's a volatile relationship, not as part of a larger pattern of abuse,
Right.
like a violation of someone's rights.
And Michelle Fiennes in this witness history piece, like, she really captures that public conversation, those like underlying attitudes. It's not just about what happened in Lithuania, but like how France wrestled with all of this in the years that followed.
Totally. And, just to be super clear for anyone listening, we're not just like throwing out our own opinions here.
No.
We're really pulling directly from, the historical accounts and the firsthand stories that are presented in this BBC program. Fiennes reporting, her perspective, they're super valuable for understanding how complex the public's reaction was. And, the social context surrounding this whole tragedy.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. We've got this high-profile couple, a really violent event that happened in Lithuania, the legal proceedings, the early release, and then Cantat going back to music. But the main thing we're focusing on here, on this deep dive, is that deep division that this caused in France.
Absolutely. It all comes back to that central question that the source highlights.
Yeah.
Was this a clear-cut case of murder, or was there some way to frame it, at least partially, as a crime of passion?
Right.
And like we've been talking about, that very question brought to light a lot of the attitudes about domestic violence in France at that time. Attitudes that, the BBC source, they called them outdated.
It really makes you think. So for everyone listening, here's something to consider. How does all the attention and scrutiny that celebrities get, how does that sometimes maybe warp how we understand really serious issues, issues like violence?
Yeah.
And how can one event, even a tragic one, act like a spotlight and show us these deeper truths about a society? And they're not always pretty truths,
Right.
What can we learn from how people responded to Marie Trintignant's death and the controversy around Bertrand Cantat? How does it inform our understanding of domestic violence? And how has that understanding evolved, not just in France, but, maybe everywhere since 2003? It's definitely something to think about.
It is. It really underscores how these personal tragedies can end up becoming these turning points. They force us to confront things, these difficult realities, and hopefully to learn and grow in how we respond to these crucial issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that was a lot to take in.
It was. It was heavy but important.